welcome everyone to another video in our Pawn Structure 101 series. I am International Master Daniel Rensch. This is chess.com, and you are awesome. That's right. Be happy with yourself. Smile in the mirror every once in a while. All right, like Stuart Smalley. All right, guys. So, we are talking about the Stonewall now. We did the Panoff structure. We did the minority attack. We did some opening discussions regarding some of the complex structures, which are positions with kind of multiple points of tension, tend to be called the complex structures. So that's a little summary. Hopefully you've seen those videos, and this is not foreign territory to you as far as what we're doing here. Now, you will notice that this is a Stonewall structure for white. I haven't moved any of the pawns for black. Why did Danny do that? Has he lost his mind? No, is the answer. What I'm doing here is I want you to focus on looking at the pawn structure for white before black has committed anything, so that when you face these structures, you're aware of the potential weaknesses and strengths behind the structure for white before you even commit your position as black. Now, you also maybe you're thinking you're somebody who plays this for white. Obviously we're going to talk about both sides' plans, okay? But what we're doing here right now is we're also going to be talking about our critical thinking skills, okay? Instead of just developing our pieces before we look at the pawn structure, before we decide what our plan is going to be, you have to see that really at a high level it's the opposite. You should be looking at the pawn structure and what your opponent is doing for move one, and then developing your pieces accordingly. That's really what it's all about, okay? So what the Stonewall is doing, okay, is a number of things. It's gripping the center on the dark squares. That's obvious, okay? Most of the time you're going to see this structure followed up with a move like c3. White is solidifying that he's going to have this brick wall in the center for some time. Obviously the e5 point is a strong point. If black gives away that square in any of the d5 variations, you're always going to see a knight hop into that square. And when the knight hops into that square, like I said, after something with d5, you're going to see the potential for a kingside attack, whether that's the other knight coming from d2 to f3 or a possible rook lift. In an ideal world for white, you'd see a bishop on d3, which points toward the kingside, and even the possibility of the c1 bishop maneuvering around to come and join the fray on the kingside, join the party. This is important stuff, okay, because what we just talked about there is exactly what white wants to do in a perfect world. He wants to grip the dark squares, then he wants to use the critical dark square, meaning e5, to sort of jumpstart and trampoline his attack on the king side. That's exactly what he wants to do. And in an ideal world, every time you see this structure, white would like to achieve that. I want to point out that one of the first games we did, actually, my game with Vucic, where I got my butt kicked, we talked a little bit about the grip of the e5 square and dealing with the Tory positions, because this particular structure here occurs a lot of the time. If you took back the f pawn and put this pawn on c3, now what you're dealing with is a lot of the sideline, the Queen's Gambit sidelines that, like I said, my friend Sam Shanklin did a video series on that. You should check it out. But here you can see Tory positions, which is essentially this structure with the bishop being developed to g5. The London is essentially the same thing with the bishop going to f4. The Collie is the same thing, but rather than developing the bishop at all, you're emphasizing other things like getting the knight going and pushing the f pawn. And finally, there is the Zugatork, which is the idea of playing b3 with a similar sort of structure, because the bishop tends to also be well placed for attacking chances on the king side when it comes to this diagonal. With all that being said, I really want to, hopefully you'll remember those different examples I gave here, because what I want to point out is that this type of structure, what makes this system effective is not that they just play one line, the Stonewall, the Zugatork, the Tory, the London, the Collie, whatever, okay, or even the birds, which is f4 on move 1, can be classified there. It's that they understand the structure, and if you're playing this stuff as white, and you're really trying to be one of those system players that I made fun of in the last video, is saying instead of learning a lot of mainline structures, you just learn a system. I was kind of joking, but if you're committing to trying to be a really good Tory player, if you're out there, my advice is that you learn the structure in terms of all the different ways that white can bring his pieces toward the king side and do the attack, whether it's a fianchetto of the bishop, aka Zugatork lines, or a birds, or whether it's the development of the bishop outside the chain, whether it's a Collie or a London, and the bishop develops out here, or a Tory. And if you want to be effective with these systems, you got to understand everything I just talked about how to develop. Again, I'll repeat it. A grip on the dark squares, control over e5, excuse me, and the potential for attacking over on the king side. Okay, now what about black? So we just did our description of what's going on here for black, for white, and now we'll do, as I said, we're going to try to start off every video with some solving. I wasn't really interested in giving solving for both sides. I wanted to kind of describe what white's trying to do, and now I'd like to put the ball in the court of thinking about this position from the black perspective, and saying, okay, now that you know that, let's say you finally had the advice. Let's say you've lost some games to these Stonewalls and you're like, oh, God, Danny's so awesome. I'm finally learning how I'm going to beat these systems. Well, I'm going to ask you to do some work first. Now that you know all the different ways white can develop and all the different ways you can see this structure, but that all of them have a similar goal pretty much of attacking on the king side, I want to ask you, what do you think the best ways are for black to develop to meet this structure? What do you think the best ways are for black to bring his pieces into the center, to do with his pawns, whether, any one of these pawns? What is the best thing for him to do? Is it fianchettoing bishops? Is it not fianchettoing? Is it committing in the structure? Is it meeting it with a Stonewall yourself? Trying to play a position where you have the Stonewall, meeting the Stonewall with a Stonewall, right? There's a number of different things you can do, but I want to ask you to take a little bit and decide what your most what your position of choice would be. Go ahead. Sip of my coffee. All you caffeine addicts just like love the coffee. Yeah, love it. Delicious. All right, we're back. Hopefully you didn't actually listen to what I said. Hopefully you were pausing the video, because otherwise, that's probably obnoxious. So, all right, but we're back. Okay, there's a number of things you can do here. I don't really... Partly it was unfair for me to ask you that question, because really what you should be asking is somewhere along the lines of, what do you play against d4? What do you play against e4? Are you a Nimzo player? Are you a King's Indian player? Are you a Slav player? So depending on what you might play against d4, because d4 tends to be the most popular move for this structure to be reached, you're almost always going to see that structure reached with the starting move one being d4. Okay, whether they play the Tory, call it whatever, you're going to see this move first. And if you're a Queen's Gambit or a Slav player, you're going to have more trouble dealing with these positions, because one of the things that everyone would agree is the easiest way to deal with these Stonewall type positions are for King's Indian type players. You develop the knight to f6. You put the pawn on d6, which naturally controls some of the dark squares already challenging white. And then when you fianchetto the bishop, you're putting sort of a blunt on the bishop on d3, which is going to make it a little bit difficult. And again, the bishop on g7 is going to be naturally developed to challenge any situations of his bishop on the diagonal, as well as to support e5 and c5. So you can see that if you're a King's Indian player, okay, it's much easier to be prepared and to deal with these Stonewall, Tory type systems without even having to do much thought. Okay, what about if you're a Nimzo player? See, I'm a Nimzo player, and so what I do a lot of the times is I'm going to start with knight f6, because you don't know yet. They could still play c4 and you're in a mainline Nimzo. But if you start to get the hint either by e3 followed by f4, which is going to be the game we're going to see here, or by knight f3 followed by something, development of the bishop or a Zukertorg or something. Once you start to get the hint that they're headed that direction, my mindset quickly becomes to challenge the dark squares, even though I can't necessarily. Okay, let's say after knight f3 is played, I can't necessarily play g6, because if I do, I'm transposing into a King's Indian, which is not my opening. I can play e6, and then once this position is committed, let's say, I know they're not playing a Queen's Gambit, and so I can immediately try to start challenging the dark squares with c5, d6. I'm usually going to fianchetto this bishop here to help control e4, and I may not even do anything with these pawns right away, but my goal is to just sort of get some challenge on the center, so that he doesn't have an easy time trampolining his attack, getting knight e5 followed by f4, and the attack gets started. Okay. I'm just trying to give some different advices of development against this structure. But coming full circle, just to kind of reiterate what probably the worst thing is that you can have. The worst thing that you can have usually is a position where you play d5, because in those positions, whether they're a Stonewall or a Tory or any of those things, when they're able to get control over the e5 square, it allows everything about their attack, after the knight comes in and everybody starts pushing toward the king side, it allows everything about their attack to have a trampoline. So if you're a Slav player, Okay, quit the Slav. I'm just joking. Okay, the Slav is the best. All right, that would be pretty funny if Danny gave you advice to quit the best opening, right? No, don't quit the Slav. But be aware, be more wary when you start seeing moves like this on move two, or E3 on move two. Okay, when you start seeing those types of ideas, you got to be more wary of the fact that you've given up this square. So every time he develops into one of those systems where he's attacking with the king side, a Stonewall structure slash system, you're going to be in a little bit of trouble. So the best thing I can recommend, depending on how well you know maybe some other transitions, if you're I don't know, if you're maybe 2200 player, even 2000 player, you might have the idea already that you don't have to only play a Slav. Just because you've committed D5, maybe they start developing toward a clear Stonewall, and so as soon as that's for sure, you play a move like G6. Now, is this going to be easy for you as a Slav player? No, not necessarily, but you can't take back that you play D5. That's the beauty and the pain of pawn structure. And you already have my advice that the hardest structure to attack, outside of trying to play a Yugoslav attack, which is again a subject for another video, one of the hardest structures to attack is a fianchetto system. So if you develop with a fianchetto system, put the bishop on G7, you can still play for the potential of C5, and actually still play the potential after your knight comes out of E5. It's not going to be as easy as if your pawn were on D6, but it's possible. And because the fianchetto structure is hard to attack, that is one of the ways I would recommend facing the Stonewall, even if you're a D5 player. Now, maybe it seems like crazy advice because we're talking about random positions here with no pieces on the board. But believe me, this is important stuff because instead of continually just approaching your games from the opening theory, and which you may not even know that much of, start looking at every game as the structure is being committed, starting from move one. And as soon as you have the idea of the structure that you're getting yourself into, you're going to have this advice from these videos of how to develop your pieces accordingly. So again, you may say, well, I've never played positions with C5. I'm not a Grunfeld or a King's Indian player. I'm a Slav player. I want to play C6. Well, okay, you can continue to say that you're only going to play C6, and then when you've made no challenge on the dark squares, and he's putting his knight here and rook lifting and checkmating you, then whose fault is that going to be? So again, think outside the box in terms of what openings you think you play. The best players in the world play all openings. They play every structure. They play everything. And more importantly, they play with Kramnik's mindset, which is, I don't play a position. I let the position play me. Style is an illusion to a certain degree. Okay, you have to understand every structure that you can be faced with. So even if it's not your favorite position, I don't like playing against a Stonewall. Who does? All right? I'm aware of what I need to do to attack that structure. Whether I like it or not is irrelevant. Whether it's my style or not is irrelevant. It's a joke. Okay, so get out of your style mindset. You need to know how to attack it. So if you try to play like a Slav against this, and he's bringing everybody, and the kitchen sink over to the king side, and you're not challenging the dark squares, you're gonna get taken to Smashtown. One-way ticket. No get out of jail free card. Yeah, I just made that up right now. How awesome is that? All right, here we go. So hopefully that little summary I just gave, sort of, criticizing you, but I don't even know you, but just talking about what your mindset needs to be. Hopefully you're taking in these things we're talking about as far as this structure goes, as far as being aware of what's going on when you're facing a Stonewall, these positions that are like really grippy. They're trying to create this like grip action on the center so that you can't shake things up, because all they want to do is play their little attacking system. So what you got to do is be aware of that and be aware that the critical points are to make challenges in the dark squares in the center. Okay. Yes, you have an outpost square on E4. I guess I probably should have mentioned that, but the reason why is because it's kind of an overrated aspect of the position, because white is often developed with bishops and knights, and like I said, the best systems are usually when you haven't played D5. So trying to use that E4 square is not something that is occurring in every position as much as you might think it is. Although I do want to point out, because we're trying to just point out all the different features, not being biased, that there is also an outpost square on E4, something you can keep in mind. Finally, I guess before we move on to the game, I guess we should make one note, resetting some of the structure here, of what happens if you're playing Stonewall versus Stonewall. Okay, if you're playing Stonewall versus Stonewall, you need to quit the game of chess because you're boring. All right, just joking. But if you're playing Stonewall versus Stonewall, you both have outpost squares on E4 and E5. You both are essentially trying to battle over the same things as I just described. All the things the white's playing for, black might be trying to do the same thing. But ironically, this is what I wanted to point out, is that ironically, even if you're playing Stonewall versus Stonewall, because that position, both sides are playing for the same thing, the way that I would recommend for both sides to try for an advantage would be to play for moves like c4 or c5 to, again, challenge the center points. In some positions, if you're castle queen side, in either case, you might even consider playing for g4 or g5 to attack the enemy's king. Okay, it's interesting that, so even to answer the question, we just did all the talks about the dynamic ways to play against a Stonewall, not the symmetrical Stonewall. But what's funny is even if you play a symmetrical Stonewall, the critical points of how to outplay are still the same. You got to make challenges to the critical points in the center, not to just sit there unless you just want to draw. Sit there and just and not challenge any of the critical points in your opponent's position. So same advice actually goes even for a symmetrical Stonewall. Again, have mercy on me. I'm not going to be able to cover every single different example in every single video. Okay, so you just got to stay tuned. We got a lot of videos to go. But even in the whole series, because the idea is that we're trying to summarize and give general perspectives to positions that have been played hundreds and hundreds and thousands of times. But if you buy into that and buy into the mindset that you need to be able to look at any structure and just know what the plans are so that you can start developing your opening repertoire and learning theory with more purpose and learning theory to higher level, if you just buy into the general mindset of what we're trying to do here, it's going to be very useful for you. Okay, if you're not in that mindset and you're trying to see exact examples of every different possible development, we'll be here for hours. Okay, and that's not practical. All right, we got stuff to do. So here we go. This was a game that I played as black facing a direct Stonewall. What better example to do it than to see a game that I played? We're going to talk about, some of the little things that were done by both of us, maybe things that could have been done better, but hopefully see an example. This is a game that I won, where eventually the critical breakthroughs were made against the Stonewall, and that helped my attacking chances. Coffee. Delicious. Okay, here we go. D4, knight f6, e3, e6. I'm a Nimzo player, okay, not a scientist, all right? Probably in more experience now I know enough things. This game was a long time ago, but now I know enough about a number of different openings that if someone committed this, I would probably immediately play g6 and then c5 and play extended and accelerated King's Indian versions to start immediately challenging their issues. But I was more obsessed with still reaching my Nimzo structures at this time and didn't want to vary. I played e6. After bishop d3, I played b6. After f4, I played bishop b7 and eventually got c5. This is pretty standard stuff and also very acceptable way to play. White plays c3, I played d6. Notice I didn't play d5. I'm criticizing this move because, especially for players who aren't d4, d5 players. If you're a Slav or a Queen's Gambit player, you're going to play those moves because you don't have any psychic way of knowing your opponent's going to play a Stonewall. So that's why my advice was, once the Stonewall starts to become clear to you and is committed, keeping the option open of fiend-kettling a bishop on g7, but still trying to challenge the dark squares is the best thing you can do. In a position like this, now that I know it's being committed, and if I haven't committed the d-pawn, the last thing I'm going to do is play d5 and give away the e5 square, which, like we said, is a jump start to the attack. So I play d6. We head down a natural road, queen c7, knight d2, and knight c6. Again, I think this is a mistake. Just like my game with Mladen Vucic, I probably should have played knight b to d7. Okay, again, for no other reason than that it keeps this bishop open. In the Vucic game, I ended up castling short, so there was also the prophylactic potential of the knight coming to f8 where there is no checkmate. But in this situation, I think the main advantage of this would just be to keep the bishop open. Both these moves prepare the potential of playing e5, okay? But knight to d7 is probably a little bit better. I played knight c6, and after king to h1, I played bishop to e7, and my opponent played the move e4. Okay? What's interesting about the way I've developed here is that by not doing anything obvious in the center, like d5, giving away a square, or like taking, which is usually the worst thing you can do against a Stonewall position, is take these pawns before you have to. Because all you do is you help them eliminate one of the biggest weaknesses of a Stonewall structure. One of the biggest weaknesses of a Stonewall structure is the dark squared bishop, or if it's a Stonewall for black, the light squared bishop. Okay? Because the one piece that, best case scenario, takes lots of moves to get in the game, the one piece that is that bad is the bishop, is the dark square bishop. So when you change the structure, they're essentially playing for the same exact things they were before, but now a much easier time once they start advancing to get all of their pieces in the attack. So one of these notices is the sort of the advantage of what I'm doing here is I'm just putting pressure on the squares. I'm not going to change the structure. I learned my Vucic lesson. I'm not going to play e5 too quickly either and weaken my own outpost squares. I'm just going to keep tension in the position, okay, and make her have to change the structure or lash out, because she's going to struggle to do that if she can't get knight to e5. So here she finally plays e4. Once I see e4, I know we're going to be headed toward a sharp game, because there's no going back once she pushes these pawns this far advanced, and the only thing she's going to want to do is keep pushing them forward. So my job is to be ready for the tactics and to let the stone wall sort of implode on itself. One final thing to note is that I was maintaining flexibility here because I did have the idea already of castling long. One of the other cool ways, other than directly challenging the dark squares, we talked about c5 and e5 in terms of how to play against a stone wall. The other way we mentioned, but here is more of a reality, is the idea of g5. Attacking the lead pawn with g5 is another possibility, especially in scenarios of a race position, because it makes sense to open the files against the enemy king anyway. Okay, so another way to attack the dark squares for me would be to play for h6 and g5. So as soon as she committed e4, she was a master player, by the way. Again, no names, witness protection. Okay, castles. I castled long. Could I have castled short? Yes. And would she have been happier if I did that? Yes. She probably would have played e5, and on knight d5, probably something like knight to e4. I don't think that I'm losing here, but especially given the fact that I played knight to c6 earlier instead of knight d7, I don't like my chances of defending against the onslaught of every single piece she's going to bring over here. You look at attacking in the direction of her structure, she's a very easy time doing so. So, in anticipation for what she was going to do, I decided to castle long. E5 is, again, also possible, but again, you recognize this structure? The first video we did? Okay, ignore the F-pawn, but everybody else, all the other forms of tension we're dealing with here is the Spanish complex, or the King's Indian complex. So if I play this, it's a possibility, okay, but I think that she would capture once, probably play d5, and this outpost square becomes a reality. Even in scenarios where she captures here and immediately starts to go for these squares, I'm not excited about opening up these types of squares for her pieces. But probably the best thing would just be to take here and get the protected pass pawn, followed by this maneuver. So I'm not going to challenge with e5. Instead, I'm going to continue to play along the lines of letting her advance herself. So I castle long. She plays queen to e2. I play king to b8, where there is no checkmate. Okay, that's not necessarily true, but let's just say it is. A4, and now I play the move h6, which I gave myself an exclamavillage. Okay, I analyzed this game a while ago when I was young, dumb, and just young and dumb. And I decided to play, to give myself an exclamavillage because I'm worth it, And h6 is a good idea because it prepares g5. At the time, I was solely focused on the potential of a phantom checkmate on h2. Maybe not a phantom checkmate, but there is dynamic tension there. But really, even regardless of the phantom checkmate, it's the right positional idea to make a challenge of the dark squares and to go for g5. So h6 is a good move. She plays bishop h6. I captured and played g5, and I'm pretty happy with the position here. There's a lot of analysis here. I actually analyzed this game for a long time based on this f takes g5 idea, just to prove that the sacrifice was worth it with the potential of the attack. Not going to go over everything here, but I will give one critical line, that if they simply take and take, because if you think about it, if you're not going to take the pawn, it doesn't make any sense to take it once. If she takes it once, she's inviting, the sheep inviting the wolves, all kinds of attacking chances. So if you're going to take it, you're going to take it again. Okay? So I would play knight to g4, and if she goes back to f3, there's a couple of different ideas. One of them is actually an immediate sacrifice on h2. The others are ideas of trying to create more possible tactics, bringing more pieces, keeping this discovery idea open. I don't want to do it right away based on ideas of e5 and what have I achieved. But even simple plans like bishop h4, followed by the idea of either doubling rooks after she captures, or maybe even doubling rooks immediately. Black's got lots of compensation for the pawn. We can't go over all the analysis. So I decided to look at the sharpest line of rook takes f7, I can't take here because my queen hangs. However, after rook takes h2, king to g1, other rook over, only move knight h3, blocking the h-file. And then the brilliant sacrifice I had planned was rook takes g2, followed by knight to e3 check. Okay, at this moment, I'm down a whole rook. However, on moves like king f2, I have knight to c2, this guy's hanging, and I have the threat of bishop h4 check, winning the rook immediately. This position is winning for black, according to my analysis. After takes, knight e3 check, king to g1, black can capture on h3, and the position is also practically winning for black. Lots of compensation. Not really any way she's gonna be able to prevent the idea of even making a small sidestep move followed by sliding over to the king side. This game is over. So she didn't take the pawn on g5. Instead, she played the move a5, but I was anticipating this because she thinks, oh, you sacrifice a pawn, I don't take it. I get to sacrifice a pawn, you don't take it. But I say, nay, you sacrifice pawns, I capture those pawns. I take on a5. She played e5, which seems like a nice way for her to play an aggressive move and free up the square, but I don't think it really helped her to bring this knight to d5. Although it should be noted that even without e5, we already like black's position a lot because of the fact that black's up a pawn. This exchange sacrifice on a5 is not going to achieve anything. And you're still dealing with a position where if white tries to win the pawn back, it seems like black's attacking chances on the open two files are much better than white's attacking chances that she just got by sacrificing the pawn. So she plays e5, I played knight d5, knight to e4 comes in. I calculated a little bit here, decided it was worth it to play g4, even though it was not my original intention to keep the king side closed. I thought I would just start, taking and shaking and baking, right? Like the Magic Man, open everything up. But instead of shake and bake, I calculated a little bit and played g4 because I saw that after captures everything and she gets this knight to she wants to get the knight to e5 move. Instead of capturing back, oops, forgot to play the move that she played, which was a5. We backed up in analysis. So a5 takes, e5 here, knight here, I play g4. So again, what I calculated was that in this position, instead of me capturing here and giving her what she wanted, which was knight e5, which would, by the way, actually have multiple threats, including rook takes a5 followed by knight c6, as well as knight f7 check, some tricky business. I had calculated that I had the move e takes f3, and g takes f3. Because after knight to b5 takes g2, her attack is not as good as she once thought it was. Rook to g8 check, king to f2. If king h1 was played, among other things, I can play the move queen to b7. Queen to c6 would not be good based on the not the tactic of rook takes a5, because now we have discovered checkmates, but because of queen takes a7 check. So queen to b7 followed by an exchange is good enough for black to be practically winning. He's still up material, and white's got a lot more weaknesses than black does. So, but she played king f2 because she didn't want me to be able to force the queen trade. She thought that she was checkmating me over there. I played queen to e7 and said, all right, sister, now your king is in more danger than mine. How's that feel? Queen e7, and all of a sudden she realized that, avoiding the queen trade maybe wasn't such a good idea because there's nothing she can do. Everything is guarded. And there's no way to stop queen h4 check, and then all of a sudden, it's a party going on the king side. So she played king f3, avoiding the immediate check of h4. I can't play queen h4 because of queen takes a7. It was a nice move, actually, but I went back to queen b7, forcing the endgame now. She played, after queen to b7, excuse me, king f3, oh no, sorry, okay. Before I played queen to b7, I played c4. My idea, I'm pretty sure, was just to prevent ideas of her ever being able to open me up for all time and space. So I played c4, and after bishop e3, now I played queen to b7. She had to trade. We took with the king. She tries to challenge on the g file. We say, no way, Jose. We play f5. She plays rook a to e1. We play the move a6. She plays the move knight to d6 check, trying to hope that I take it and give her g8. But, I'm not that stupid. I play king c7, chop, chop. Knight to f7, knight to c6. The knight on f7 is running out of squares. She didn't want to take h6 because rook here and winning this pawn is probably better for me than that pawn is for her. So she played the move rook to e2. I decided to go ahead and offer a trade. She can't take on h6 because the knight is immediately trapped. And so she played knight takes d8. Oh no, sorry, she played knight takes h6. That's right. My analysis was knight takes d8, which is what she should have done. But she played knight takes h6 and resigned. If she had played knight takes d8, number of moves, but basically king takes d8, and now we see a classical position where black won the battle with Stonewall. Why? We have a good knight versus bad bishop. One of the things I probably should be foreshadowing a little bit better about how to really evaluate these pawn structures, something I should be better than I'm doing, is one of the things you got to think about whenever you're playing a pawn structure is not just all the things we've been talking about, but what minor pieces are good and what minor pieces are bad. In a Stonewall is a classic example of that the dark squared bishop is potentially white's worst piece. The piece that will be this big thorn in the side, basically is doing nothing, like serving the purpose of an overgrown pawn. And being aware of what minor pieces you want to keep on the board is also one of the keys to outplaying somebody at a high level, because you want to anticipate the pawn structure, know all these things that we're trying to learn, and also anticipate the evolution of the pawn structure, what exchanges to make, how to challenge it, how to put tension, all that stuff. And we talked a lot about that with the Stonewall. But the other thing to keep in mind is that if your opponent has a bad minor piece, it's like a French c8 bishop. When you have in a French pawn structure, the bishop on c8, just a bad minor piece. When you're dealing with a position where you're aware of what your opponent's worst piece is, the worst piece on the board, it's good to keep that in mind. It can allow you to, as I always like to say, is impose your will on the position. Imposing your will essentially means having a better idea of where you want the game to head than your opponent. So you just sort of drive the game, you steer the game that direction. You don't make careless trades. You're aware of the type of positions that are potentially better for you. And if there's one that I would say a Stonewall is good to be aware of, that is the knight versus bishop. Almost always, if you have a good knight versus bad bishop ending, you're dealing with a dominant minor piece. One ironic thing is if you look at just the queen side here, by the way, this is sort of like a pan-off structure. Black has a 3-on-2, sort of reversed. And white is down a pawn, dominant minor piece versus a not-so-good minor piece, and the game is easily lost. Obviously, she made it easier with knight takes h6. I'm not denying that, but I think we've learned that black was better here. So, what did we learn about the Stonewall today? Well, we spent a lot of time talking about the position without the pieces on the board, and hopefully you remember the critical moment. As far as playing the Stonewall, your white's doing exactly the opposite of kind of what happened in this game. White doesn't want to overextend the structure. Even if black is smart enough not to play d5. Okay, if your opponent extends the pawn, if you're playing a Stonewall, and they give you the knight jump, those are your ideal positions and the positions you want to do the attack in. If they don't, and they're smart enough to maintain the tension on the dark squares, you have to be careful not to lash out before you've completed your development. Probably the biggest mistake white made was playing this e45 idea before she had moved the queen, the bishop, or any of the other pieces. And opening the position and overextending the structure allowed black to just kind of say, all right, come on, go ahead, come and get me. And the more white pushed the pawns, the worse the position became. Also keep in mind your bad minor piece if you're white. So from the black perspective, we've given the best advice we can, which is control the dark squares, eventually challenge the dark squares with either the c5 or the e5 breaks, or even as in a game like this, the g5 break is a potential way to challenge the dark squares. So those are sort of the key recipes for playing against the Stonewall positions, and some of the transpositions that occur from the other d4 openings, as we referred to, the Tory and the Collie and all that stuff. A lot of advice about those positions can be found in Sam Shanklin's series on 1d4 sidelines. Otherwise, just remember the overall philosophy idea is that you want to, even if you can't necessarily break with these moves, you want to at least control these squares and not play moves like d5, giving those squares up. Finally, I'll just repeat that if you're a Queen's Gambit player and you run into these systems, probably as soon as it becomes very clear to you, E3 is an obvious one. I guess knight f3 is more flexible. As soon as it becomes very clear to you that they're not going to be playing a mainline Queen's Gambit, the best thing you can do is to play c5 yourself. In a lot of cases, fiend-counting this bishop is going to help your defense on the king side. But even if you don't, you've got to make a challenge of the dark squares with c5 and hopefully later on the potential of even e5. And the disadvantage for them is that if they play knight f3, the Stonewall is the most direct version of taking advantage of the e5 square. So if you're a Queen's Gambit player and they play this way, you're not in the worst shape in the world as long as you can still play for c5 and some of the early lines where the queen comes out, as Sam talks about in his video series. So, okay. That's it. I mean, we summarized the pawn structure. Hopefully, we're still doing a good job, and keep on keeping on, right? The next pawn structure we're going to be going over is the Karo-Slav family. Okay, the Karo-Slav family is essentially the pawn structures that can occur from Karo-Khans and Queen's Gambits and Slav positions. So, should be fun for all you Slav players who got made fun of today or told that, don't play d5 against a Stonewall. It's true. I mean, it's not like you can switch your opening, but I wasn't lying. It's not the ideal situation to have the pawn on d5, but you got to do what you got to do because, you have other reasons you play your opening. So, all right, have a wonderful day here on chess.com, and don't get lost on the internet.